What?
For decades, Iran believed it had built one of the most secure military systems in the Middle East. Deep inside mountains and hidden beneath layers of rock and reinforced concrete, Tehran constructed what it proudly called its missile cities. These underground complexes were designed to do one thing: survive a war. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, storage depots for ballistic missiles, launch pads hidden behind massive steel doors, and command centers buried nearly 100 meters underground. In theory, these facilities would allow Iran to ride out an air campaign, keep its missiles safe, and strike back whenever the moment came. For years, Iranian state media proudly broadcast videos of these underground bases. Rows of missiles lined the tunnels. Military trucks moved through cavernous underground roads. Commanders described the system as untouchable, but in modern warfare, the difference between a fortress and a trap can be surprisingly small. According to reporting from Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, a series of large-scale airstrikes targeting Iranian military infrastructure dramatically changed the situation. Surveillance aircraft, satellites, and drones began tracking movements around known missile bases. Soon after, waves of precision strikes targeted tunnel entrances, support buildings, and launch infrastructure. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Washington Post suggested that several facilities suffered visible damage at key access points. For a system designed to hide underground, the entrances turned out to be the most vulnerable points. Military analysts say that when these access routes are damaged or blocked, underground bases can quickly lose their operational effectiveness. Missiles may remain intact, but they cannot easily be deployed. In other words, the very tunnels that once promised security could suddenly become isolation. And that raises a larger strategic question that many experts are now asking. Did Iran's massive underground missile network provide the protection it was designed for? Or did it create a system that becomes dangerously fragile once the skies above it are no longer contested? To understand how this happened, we first need to look at how Iran built this system in the first place. To understand why these underground bases matter so much, we have to go back nearly 4 decades, long before the current tensions in the Middle East. Iran's military planners were already thinking about one terrifying possibility: what would happen if the United States or Israel ever launched a large-scale air campaign against Iran? They had watched what happened to Iraq in 1991. They saw how American air power dismantled Saddam Hussein's military in just weeks. And Tehran reached a clear conclusion: if Iran wanted its missiles to survive a war, they couldn't be left out in the open. So the digging began. Deep inside mountains across the country, engineers and military units started building an enormous underground network. Not just bunkers, but entire subterranean military complexes. Long tunnels carved through rock, hidden storage depots, underground launch systems, and command centers buried far below the surface. Over time, these facilities became known as Iran's missile cities. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Iran today possesses the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Estimates suggest the country may have several thousand missiles, ranging from short-range battlefield systems to medium-range weapons capable of reaching targets far beyond its borders. To protect this arsenal, the underground network continued expanding for years. Iranian state television occasionally released dramatic footage from inside these bases. Cameras would move slowly through enormous tunnels, where rows of missiles stood under bright lights. Military trucks rolled past them. Commanders walked confidently through the underground corridors. The message was clear. Iran wanted the world to believe that even if war came, its missile force would survive. Some of these tunnels were reportedly dug 80 to 90 meters underground, hidden beneath thick rock formations. According to various military analysts cited by Reuters, these depths were meant to shield the facilities from conventional airstrikes, and for a long time the strategy appeared to make sense. A missile system hidden underground is harder to detect. harder to destroy, harder to eliminate in a single strike. But there was always a critical limitation. Missiles buried underground cannot launch themselves. At some point, the launchers must move. Doors must open. Vehicles must emerge. Equipment must reach the surface. And in modern warfare, where satellites, drones, and surveillance aircraft watch constantly, that moment can be incredibly dangerous. What once looked like an invisible fortress could suddenly reveal itself. And that moment, as some analysts now argue, may have become the most vulnerable point in the entire system. Because once the skies above Iran were no longer contested, the hidden network beneath the mountains was no longer invisible. For years, Iran believed its underground missile network could survive almost any attack. But late one night, the war in the skies over the Middle East began to change that assumption. According to reports from Reuters and the Associated Press, a large wave of coordinated airstrikes targeted Iranian military infrastructure across multiple regions. The strikes were not random. They followed weeks, in some cases months, of intelligence gathering. Satellites had mapped the terrain, signals intelligence tracked communications, and surveillance drones quietly monitored activity around suspected missile facilities. When the strikes began, they were precise. Military analysts speaking to the Wall Street Journal noted that modern air campaigns often start the same way: neutralize air defenses, establish control of the skies, and then begin systematically dismantling the enemy's military infrastructure. Once air defenses weaken, the battlefield changes dramatically. Aircraft can fly longer patrols. Drones can loiter overhead for hours. And any movement on the ground becomes visible. In this case, analysts say that visibility may have been crucial. Some of the strikes reportedly targeted infrastructure around suspected missile bases, including support buildings, storage depots, and most importantly, tunnel entrances. According to satellite imagery examined by the Washington Post, several locations associated with Iran's missile program showed signs of damage after the first waves of strikes. Craters appeared near access roads and structures linked to underground facilities. For a system built to hide beneath the mountains, the entrances became the most exposed part. Think of the missile bases like underground ports. The missiles themselves may be safe inside the tunnels, but without functioning access points, moving them out becomes extremely difficult. Military experts interviewed by Defense News explain that modern air campaigns often aim to disrupt logistics rather than destroy every piece of equipment. If launch vehicles cannot reach the surface, if support infrastructure is damaged, if communication lines are interrupted, then the entire system slows down. And in warfare, slowing down your opponent can be just as important as destroying them. Meanwhile, the skies above the region were becoming increasingly crowded. Surveillance aircraft and drones began flying continuous monitoring missions. Analysts say this kind of persistent observation creates a powerful advantage. Even brief moments of activity, a truck moving, a door opening, equipment emerging from a tunnel, can quickly draw attention. Within minutes, strike aircraft or armed drones can be directed toward the target. This is one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare. Battles are no longer fought only with bombs and missiles. They are fought with information. Every satellite image, every radar signal, every movement on the ground. All of it feeds into a constantly evolving picture of the battlefield. And once that picture becomes clear, the hidden network beneath the mountains is no longer completely hidden. Which leads to the question many analysts are now asking: what happens to a military system designed to hide underground, when the skies above it are watched every second of the day? By the time the air campaign intensified, the conflict in the Middle East was already entering a dangerous phase. Tensions between Iran and its regional rivals had been rising for months. Missile exchanges, drone attacks, and proxy clashes across the region had created a volatile environment stretching from the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean. According to Reuters, the region had already seen a surge in missile launches, drone interceptions, and naval incidents before the latest wave of strikes. Military analysts warned that the situation had the potential to escalate quickly if one side attempted to disable the other's strategic capabilities. That is where the focus on underground facilities became critical. Iran's missile cities were not ordinary bases. They were built specifically to survive airstrikes. Destroying them required weapons designed for one purpose, penetrating deep underground structures. Among the most discussed weapons in recent reports is the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, often described as one of the most powerful bunker-busting bombs ever developed. According to the Wall Street Journal, the bomb weighs roughly 30,000 pounds and is designed to punch through layers of reinforced concrete and rock before detonating deep underground. Only a limited number of aircraft are capable of carrying such weapons, most notably the stealth bomber B-2 Spirit. Military analysts interviewed by Defense News explain that bunker-busting munitions are used in a very specific way. Rather than trying to destroy an entire underground complex in a single strike, air forces often focus on the critical access points, tunnel entrances, ventilation shafts, support infrastructure, access roads. If those elements are damaged or blocked, the underground facility may remain intact, but it becomes extremely difficult to operate. Satellite imagery reviewed by the Washington Post has shown that several sites associated with Iran's missile infrastructure appear to have suffered damage around their surface support areas. In modern warfare, that kind of damage can be strategically significant, because underground bases are only useful if the systems inside them can reach the surface. And once air superiority is established, aircraft and drones can monitor those access points continuously. Analysts at CSIS note that this type of persistent surveillance has transformed modern air campaigns. In earlier wars, underground bases could remain hidden for long periods. Today, satellites pass overhead multiple times per day. Drones can observe targets for hours. Signals intelligence can detect communication patterns. In other words, the battlefield is constantly being watched. This shift has changed how militaries think about hardened underground facilities. While they can still provide protection against sudden attacks, they also introduce a different kind of vulnerability. Once the entrances are exposed, the system can become easier to contain. And in the current Middle East environment, where multiple actors are closely monitoring each other's military movements, the margin for concealment has become smaller than ever, which is why many analysts now argue that underground bases, while impressive engineering achievements, may no longer guarantee the strategic advantage they once promised. As the first days of the air campaign unfolded, analysts around the world began searching for one thing: evidence. In modern conflicts, the truth of what happens on the battlefield rarely comes from a single statement. It emerges slowly through satellite imagery, intelligence assessments, and reports from multiple sources. Within days of the initial strikes, several major news organizations began examining commercial satellite images of suspected Iranian military facilities. According to the Washington Post, analysts reviewing high-resolution imagery observed visible damage at several locations connected to Iran's missile infrastructure. Some sites showed impact craters near support buildings and access roads leading to underground facilities. While it is often difficult to determine the full extent of damage from satellite images alone, these early signs suggested that the strikes had targeted key infrastructure around the bases, rather than attempting to destroy entire underground complexes outright. That approach reflects a broader strategy often used in modern air campaigns. Instead of trying to eliminate every weapon system, air forces focus on disrupting the network that allows those systems to operate. Military analysts cited by Reuters explained that missile bases depend on a complex support system: fuel storage, transportation vehicles, communications nodes, and maintenance facilities. If those supporting elements are damaged, the operational tempo of the entire missile force can slow dramatically. In some cases, it can halt operations altogether. Reports from regional media added further context. The Times of Israel, citing defense analysts, noted that several Iranian missile sites appeared to have suffered damage to infrastructure around their tunnel entrances. These areas are critical because they serve as the transition point between underground storage and launch operations on the surface. Even limited damage in these zones can create bottlenecks. Vehicles cannot move easily, equipment cannot be deployed quickly, and launch preparations become far more complicated. Meanwhile, the broader security environment in the Middle East remained tense. Naval patrols increased in the Persian Gulf. Air defense systems across the region were placed on heightened alert. Several governments warned that further escalation could trigger a wider regional confrontation. In this environment, every new satellite image, every radar track, and every military statement was analyzed carefully by governments and observers alike. Because in a conflict shaped by both technology and perception, the battle is not only about what is destroyed, it is also about what each side believes the other is capable of doing next. And as the early damage assessments began to circulate, one thing became increasingly clear. The underground missile network that Iran had spent decades building was now under intense scrutiny, not just from its adversaries, but from the entire world. As the air campaign continued, the conversation among military analysts began to shift. The early question had been simple: were the strikes hitting their targets? But after the first wave of satellite images and intelligence assessments appeared, a more complicated question emerged. What happens when a military system designed to hide underground suddenly finds itself cut off from the surface? Experts interviewed by Reuters and Defense News say that underground facilities offer protection, but they also depend heavily on access points, logistics routes, and communication systems. Without those elements, the system can quickly become isolated. Think of an underground missile base like a submarine dock. Inside the tunnels, the weapons may still exist. The equipment may still function. But if the exits are damaged, the ability to deploy those weapons becomes severely restricted. This is why many modern air campaigns focus on what analysts call containment, rather than destruction. The goal is not always to destroy every missile. Instead, the objective is to prevent them from being used. Reports from regional security observers, including analysts cited by the Times of Israel, suggest that the pressure on Iran's missile infrastructure has increased significantly as surveillance missions continue across the region. Persistent monitoring from aircraft and drones means that any attempt to move launch equipment toward the surface could be detected quickly. And once detected, that movement could become a target. In the current Middle Eastern security environment, this kind of surveillance has become a powerful strategic tool. According to assessments discussed by researchers at CSIS Modern Intelligence Networks, combine satellite imagery, radar tracking, signal interception, and drone observation to create a near-continuous picture of activity on the ground. This makes it increasingly difficult for large military systems to operate without being noticed. At the same time, tensions across the region remain high. Naval patrols continue in the Persian Gulf. Air defense systems across several countries remain on alert. Regional governments closely monitor every development, aware that even a small incident could escalate rapidly. In this environment, the strategic importance of Iran's missile network becomes even more apparent. For Tehran, those missiles represent deterrence, a way to signal that any large attack would carry consequences. For its adversaries, however, limiting that capability has become a key objective. And this is where the pressure on the underground network grows. Because if the launch systems cannot operate effectively, if movement above ground is constantly monitored, and if access points remain vulnerable to further strikes, then the underground system may still exist, but its strategic value could begin to shrink. In other words, the question is no longer simply whether the missiles survive. The real question is whether they can still influence the balance of power in the region. By this point in the conflict, many analysts were no longer just examining the damage on the ground. They were asking a deeper question. What strategic assumptions led Iran to build such an enormous underground missile network in the first place? And what risks came with that decision? For decades, Tehran invested heavily in underground infrastructure because it expected a particular type of war. A war dominated by air power. Military planners in Iran understood that they could not match the United States or Israel in terms of advanced aircraft. Instead, they focused on building a system that could survive long enough to maintain a deterrent capability. And for a time, that strategy made sense. According to research from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Iran developed one of the most extensive missile programs in the region, precisely because missiles require far less infrastructure than traditional air forces. Missiles can be hidden, stored underground, launched quickly. But the same strategy that provides protection can also create new vulnerabilities. Experts at the Modern War Institute at West Point have long noted that underground military facilities offer strong protection against sudden strikes, yet they depend heavily on a small number of critical access points. Those access points can become strategic bottlenecks. If the entrances are damaged, if the surrounding infrastructure is disrupted, if surveillance makes movement risky, the system becomes far harder to operate. Another challenge lies in the speed of modern warfare. In previous decades, military forces could sometimes recover after an initial attack. Repair crews could restore damaged facilities. Equipment could be moved under cover of darkness. Today, persistent surveillance makes that far more difficult. Satellites revisit the same locations repeatedly. Drones can remain overhead for hours. Sensors detect electronic signals from military equipment. Researchers at RAND Corporation describe this environment as one where the battlefield is increasingly transparent. And when transparency increases, mobility becomes essential. Fixed systems, even deeply buried ones, can struggle to adapt. That does not mean underground bases are obsolete. They can still provide important protection against surprise attacks. But analysts say the strategic balance has shifted. Instead of being an invisible shield, large underground facilities may become systems that require constant protection and careful coordination to remain effective. And in a region as tense and heavily monitored as the Middle East, that task becomes increasingly complex. Which leads to one final question. If underground missile networks no longer guarantee security the way they once promised, what will the next generation of military strategy look like? As the dust from the early strikes begins to settle, the broader implications of this confrontation are becoming clearer. For years, the balance of power in the Middle East has rested on a complex web of deterrence. Missiles, air defenses, naval forces, and proxy groups all formed part of a delicate equation, one where each side tried to signal strength without triggering a full-scale regional war. Iran's underground missile network played a central role in that equation. Those missiles were meant to ensure that any major attack on Iran would carry serious consequences. But recent developments have introduced new uncertainty into that calculation. If underground systems can be monitored continuously, if their access points remain vulnerable, and if air superiority allows persistent surveillance, then the traditional assumptions behind missile deterrence may begin to shift. This does not mean that Iran's military capabilities disappear overnight. Far from it. According to analysts cited by Reuters, Iran still maintains a significant missile inventory and a network of regional partners capable of exerting influence across several parts of the Middle East. But the strategic landscape is evolving. Researchers at Brookings Institution note that conflicts in the region increasingly revolve around technology, intelligence networks, precision strikes, missile defense systems, and electronic warfare. In such an environment, the ability to adapt quickly may become more important than the size of any single weapons system. At the same time, the political dimension of the crisis remains just as important as the military one. Diplomatic channels remain active behind the scenes. Governments across the region continue to call for restraint, aware that a wider conflict could have enormous consequences for global energy markets and international security. In many ways, the situation resembles a tense standoff. Each side watches the other carefully. Each new development is measured for its potential impact. Because in the modern Middle East, power is not defined solely by weapons. It is defined by perception, how strong each side appears, how credible their deterrence remains, and how far they are willing to go to defend it. That is why analysts writing in foreign affairs argue that the current moment may represent a turning point, Not necessarily the end of Iran's missile strategy, but perhaps the beginning of a new phase in how military power is organized and contested across the region. Whether that phase leads to further escalation, renewed diplomacy, or a fragile balance between the two remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: the events unfolding today are not just about underground bases or airstrikes. They are part of a much larger story: the continuing struggle to define security and power in one of the most strategically important regions of the world.